In February 1847, an artist named James Mahoney stepped off a mail coach in the town of Skibbereen, County Cork, on assignment from the Illustrated London News, and within an hour of arriving, he found a woman lying dead in a lane with a dead infant still pressed to her chest, and no one in the street had stopped to move either body because there was no one left with the strength to lift them. That image, which Mahoney sketched on the spot and which would be published in London 10 days later, is not the worst thing you will see today. It is not even close, because the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s was not a famine at all, not in the way you understand that word, not as a failure of food to exist. It was a system operating exactly as designed, killing people in a country that was still exporting enough calories to feed them twice over, and the fact that 1 million human beings died inside that system is not a tragedy of nature, it is an arithmetic of policy. You are going to walk through Black 47, the worst year in Irish history, and you are going to do it at ground level, in the mud, in the rain, in the stench of a world where dying was so ordinary that a 2-year-old boy named Tom Girren could be thrown into a mass grave at Abbeystrary Cemetery while still breathing, struck across the knees by a grave digger's shovel, and left among the dead until his whimper stopped the next spadeful of earth. Tom survived. He lived until 1910. Most of the people you will meet in the next several minutes did not. Start with the smell. That is the thing no illustration could capture, and no newspaper account adequately translated for readers in London drawing rooms. You are standing in a lane called Bridgetown, on the southern edge of Skibbereen, in January 1847, and what hits you first is not the cold, though the cold is savage, a damp Atlantic chill that seeps through wool and settles into bone. What hits you is the smell. Dr. Daniel Donovan, the town's dispensary physician, described it in his diary for the Southern Reporter as a peculiar and offensive fetor, something between rotting flesh and the sweet chemical stink of a body consuming its own muscle for fuel. It rises from every cabin. It drifts from the open doors of huts where the living and the dead share the same straw. Dr. Donovan noted that in Bridgetown alone, a single lane with a population of roughly 300, there were 85 active cases of fever in the last week of December 1846. The laneway is perhaps 200 yards long. You can walk it in 3 minutes. In the time it takes to do so, you will pass more dying people than you could count. The ground under your feet is not paved. It is packed mud, slicked with rain and human waste, because there is no sewerage, there never was, and the cesspits behind the cabins have overflowed into the lane itself. The cabins on either side of you are fourth-class dwellings, the lowest classification in the 1841 census, which defined them as windowless mud structures of a single room. 40% of all housing in Ireland fell into this category. The roof is thatch, or what remains of thatch, because many of these roofs have not been repaired in years, and the rain comes through in a dozen places. Inside, the floor is bare earth. There is no furniture. There was never much, but what existed has been sold or burned for fuel. The fire, if there is one, burns turf in a hearth that vents through a hole in the roof, and the smoke has nowhere to go on a wet day, so it fills the room at chest height, and you instinctively crouch. The bed is a pile of straw, if that, shared by the entire family, and in January 1847 that family might include a corpse that has been dead for 3 or 4 days because no one can afford a coffin, and no one has the strength to carry the body to the graveyard a mile distant. This is not an exceptional circumstance. Dr. Donovan recorded it as routine. Now understand what you ate before this happened, because the scale of the collapse only makes sense if you understand the height from which people fell. In the years before the blight, a working Irish tenant farmer consumed between 10 and 14 pounds of potatoes per day. That is not a misprint. 14 pounds. The historian K.H. Connell, in his 1950 study The Population of Ireland, concluded that 10 pounds per day was the conservative average for an adult male from the 1780s through to the famine. Women ate slightly less, perhaps 8 or 9 pounds. Children ate proportionally. The potato, specifically the Irish lumper variety, was so nutritionally dense that this monotonous diet actually delivered nearly every essential nutrient a human body requires. Combined with buttermilk, which supplied the calcium and vitamin A the potato lacked, an Irish cottier's diet was, by the clinical standards of the day, healthier than that of an English factory worker eating bread, cheese, and tea. The Devon Commission, reporting in February 1845, just months before the blight struck, described Irish labourers enduring privations unparalleled in Western Europe, but the people themselves were physically robust. They were tall, their teeth were good, their children, though barefoot and dressed in rags, were generally well nourished. That is the cruel foundation of everything that follows. The population of Ireland in 1841 was approximately 8.2 million people, and roughly 3 million of them depended almost entirely on the potato for every calorie they consumed. They owned no land. They rented patches of soil, often less than an acre, from middlemen who leased from landlords who leased from absentee owners living in England, and they paid for that acre with labour, not money. The rent for a single acre of potato ground in Connacht in the early 1840s could run between £2 and £4 per year, and the only currency a cottier had was his back. He worked the landlord's fields for free in exchange for the right to grow potatoes on a scrap of bog. Everything else the land produced, the oats, the wheat, the barley, the butter, the cattle, the pigs, went to the landlord as rent, or was sold at market and shipped to England. In 1845, more than 25 million bushels of grain were exported from Ireland to Britain. The economist Cormac O'Grada has documented that over 3 million live animals were exported from Ireland between 1846 and 1850, more animals than the number of people who emigrated. This is the thesis at the center of everything. Ireland was not a country without food. Ireland was a country whose food belonged to someone else. The blight arrived in September 1845, a waterborne oomycete called Phytophthora infestans that had crossed the Atlantic from the Toluca Valley in Mexico and swept through Belgium and southern England before reaching Irish soil. Within weeks, the potatoes in the ground turned to black slime. You could smell a blighted field before you could see it. The first year's destruction was partial, roughly 1/3 of the crop, and people suffered but survived. The second year, 1846, 3/4 of the harvest was lost, and that was when the dying began in earnest. Here is the myth you were probably taught. You were told that the Irish famine was caused by a potato blight, a natural disaster, an act of God. The nationalist leader John Mitchell, writing in 1861, offered the correction that has echoed for over a century and a half. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, he wrote, but the English created the famine. That phrase is closer to the truth than anything in a London editorial of the 1840s, but the full picture is even worse than Mitchell's formulation suggests. The blight hit all of Europe. Belgium, the Netherlands, Prussia, and Scotland all suffered significant potato crop failures. None of them experienced mass death on Ireland's scale. The reason is not complicated. In those countries, governments intervened. They halted food exports. They opened emergency grain reserves. They distributed food. The British government, under Prime Minister Lord John Russell and his Treasury Secretary Sir Charles Trevelyan, did the opposite. Trevelyan, the man with more direct control over Irish famine relief than any other single official, described the blight as a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, a mechanism of God to teach the Irish a lesson. He wrote that the real evil was not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. These are not paraphrases. These are his published words. Under Trevelyan's direction, the government launched public works schemes that required starving men to break stones and build roads in exchange for wages of roughly 8 pence per day, wages that were often delayed by weeks and that, even when paid, could not buy food at the inflated prices that famine had created. A pound of oatmeal in the winter of 1846 cost more than a full day's pay on the public works. Men walked 5, 8, 10 miles through rain and frost to reach these work sites, spent the day smashing rocks, and walked home again at nightfall to families who had not eaten. Some collapsed on the road. Dr. Donovan invented a term for it. He called it road sickness. Meanwhile, the food that Ireland actually grew continued to leave. On a single day in September 1847, the port of Cork exported 147 barrels of pork, 986 casks of ham, 27 sacks of bacon, 528 boxes of eggs, 1,397 firkins of butter, 477 sacks of oats, 720 sacks of flour, 380 sacks of barley, and 187 head of cattle. That was one port, one day, while 35 to 40 people were dying daily in Skibbereen alone. Armed constables and military escorts accompanied the food convoys to the docks. In the first 9 months of 1847, the worst year of the famine, over 822,000 gallons of butter were exported from Ireland to the English ports of Bristol and Liverpool. The country was not starving, because it lacked food. The country was starving because its food was leaving under armed guard. What happened next was that the government found a way to make things worse. In June 1847, Parliament passed the Poor Law Extension Act, which transferred the entire cost of famine relief from the British Treasury to Irish ratepayers, meaning Irish landlords were now financially responsible for feeding their own starving tenants. Attached to this act was a provision introduced by William Gregory, a Galway MP and landlord, that became known as the Gregory Clause, or the quarter-acre clause. It stated that no person who occupied more than a quarter of an acre of land could receive any form of public relief, not workhouse admission, not soup, not a single penny. The logic was simple and annihilating. If you held a tiny patch of land, the only thing standing between your family and total destitution, you had to surrender it to your landlord before the state would feed you, and once you surrendered it, you would never get it back. Landlords understood immediately what this meant. Historian James Donnelly described the Gregory Clause as indirectly a death-dealing instrument. The evictions that followed were systematic. Between 1846 and 1854, an estimated 250,000 families, roughly 500,000 people, were thrown out of their homes. Landlords sent gangs with battering rams to level the cabins so tenants could not return. Around Kilrush in County Clare, a visiting English MP estimated in 1849 that 20,000 people had been evicted in the preceding 2 years alone. Captain Arthur Kennedy, a poor law inspector, estimated that in one district 1,000 houses holding 6 people each had been leveled since November 1847. The evicted did not disappear. They built scalpeens, desperate shelters made from ditches and salvaged turf, lean-tos propped against the ruins of their own demolished walls, and they huddled in these structures through the winter, dying of exposure and fever at rates that no one reliably recorded because no one was counting anymore. The workhouse was supposed to be the safety net. In practice, it was a death trap. Skibbereen's workhouse was designed for 800 inmates. By early 1847, it held more than double that number. Between October 1846 and January 1847, 266 people died within its walls. The food inside the workhouse was stirabout, a thin porridge of Indian cornmeal and water, served twice daily in quantities designed to keep you alive but not strong, because the entire philosophy of the workhouse system was deterrence. The idea, established under the 1838 Irish Poor Law, was that conditions inside the workhouse must be worse than the worst conditions outside it, so that no one would seek admission unless they were truly desperate. By 1847, the people clawing at the workhouse gates were beyond desperate, and the institution could not hold them, and they died in the yards outside waiting for beds that would never open. 300,000 people died in Irish workhouses during the famine years. That number was considered ordinary. It was recorded in ledgers and filed in reports and sent to London, where Charles Trevelyan read them and did not change course. The alternative was the coffin ship. Between 1845 and 1855, over 2 million people fled Ireland by sea, most of them on overcrowded sailing vessels that became floating morgues. The ship Virginius departed Liverpool for Grosse Île, the Canadian quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River, carrying 476 passengers. 236 of them died during the crossing. That is a death rate of nearly 50%. On May 31, 1847, 40 ships lay at anchor off Grosse Île, waiting for quarantine inspection, their holds filled with sick and dying passengers. Of the roughly 100,000 Irish who sailed for British North America that year, 1 in 5 died, either at sea, in the quarantine sheds of Grosse Île, or in the fever hospitals of Montreal and Quebec. Over 5,000 bodies are buried on Grosse Île. Another 6,000 died in Canadian cities after disembarking. The sharks, said contemporary witnesses, could be seen trailing the ships across the Atlantic, drawn by the bodies thrown overboard each night. The passengers had paid between £3 and £5 for their passage, money that represented the liquidation of everything they owned, the last pig sold, the last scrap of furniture traded, the lease on the quarter-acre surrendered to the landlord who required their absence. They boarded ships carrying a few pounds of oatmeal, a jug of water, and the clothes on their backs, and they descended into steerage holds where they were packed 2 to a bunk in spaces 6 feet long and barely 18 inches of headroom, and the crossing took between 5 and 12 weeks depending on weather, and the ventilation hatches were sealed in storms, and the darkness was total, and the fever spread through the hold like a living thing. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery. The sick lay in their own waste, the dead lay among the living until crew dragged them up to the deck and rolled them over the rail. No clergy, no prayer, no coffin, just the sound of a body hitting water, and then nothing. In Skibbereen, the deaths were so numerous that coffins became impossible to procure, and a solution was devised that tells you everything about what ordinary meant in 1847. A trap coffin was built, sturdy enough to withstand the wear of hundreds of funerals. It had a hinged bottom that swung open when a latch was released at the graveside, and the body dropped through into the pit, and the coffin was carried back to town to collect the next corpse. At Abbeystrori Cemetery, the mass graves were called the pits, and between 8,000 and 10,000 people were deposited in them during the famine years, carried out of town on a death cart, stacked in trenches, and covered with a thin layer of straw or lime. The gravediggers worked in shifts. They were themselves among the starving. Dr. Donovan recorded in March 1847 that the domestic animals had been converted into beasts of prey that feed upon the bodies of their former owners. Dogs were eating the dead. That is not metaphor, it is clinical observation, published in the Southern Reporter. He wrote that he found the living poisoned by the exhalations from the dead, entire families still sharing their cabins with corpses days old, because no one could remove them. He described a hut near the chapel yard where 6 people with malignant fever had crawled to shelter among the graves, and the hut was surrounded by a rampart of human bones that had accumulated to such a height that the threshold was 2 feet below ground level. James Mahoney saw it. He drew it. The Illustrated London News published it, and London was horrified for approximately 1 news cycle, and then the exports continued. And here is where the structural absurdity reaches its full expression. In the very same month that Trevelyan was writing that Providence had sent the blight to reform the Irish character, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, a people who had themselves been forcibly marched along the Trail of Tears just 16 years earlier, losing thousands of their own to starvation and exposure, gathered what money they had, and sent $170 to Irish famine relief. They were among the poorest people in North America. They gave anyway. That $170, adjusted for inflation, amounts to approximately $5,000 or $6,000 today, and it arrived without conditions, without lectures on moral character, without a theology that interpreted starvation as divine instruction. The richest empire on earth could not bring itself to halt the export of butter from a starving colony. The Choctaw, who had nothing, sent what they could. That is the calculus of the Great Hunger, a system operating exactly as designed, killing people in a country that was still exporting food, while the men responsible described the dying as the corrective hand of God. Ireland's population on the eve of the famine was 8.2 million. By 1851 it had fallen to 6.6 million. By 1901 it was 4.4 million. The country has never recovered. The population of the Republic of Ireland today is still smaller than it was in 1845. No other country in Europe can make that claim. The last entry in Dr. Donovan's diary for the Southern Reporter describes a morning in March 1847 when he crossed the bridge at Skibbereen and saw a woman sitting against a wall with a bundle in her lap. She was not begging, she was not crying, she was simply sitting, looking at the river, holding what turned out to be a child who had been dead since sometime during the night. When Donovan approached her, she looked up and said nothing. She did not ask for help, she did not ask for a coffin, she just held the bundle a little tighter and went on looking at the water. That was a normal morning. If this video changed the way you think about the Irish famine, or if it made you reconsider what the word famine actually means when food is leaving the country under armed escort, I would ask you to subscribe to this channel. Every subscription, every like, every comment telling me which topic to cover next helps this channel survive its own kind of arithmetic. I will see you in the next one.